Welcome to Mind, Law, and Motive, a crime, mind, and evidence podcast where psychology and law examine the same case from different sides. In this episode, we ask whether antisocial personality disorder or the forensic construct of psychopathy provides the more accurate framework for understanding the predatory behavior of Ted Bundy. Two disciplines, one case, no easy answers. This podcast is presented for educational purposes and does not offer a clinical diagnosis of any individual. Our discussion is based on documented behavior, established psychological concepts, and retrospective case analysis. Psychological explanation does not excuse criminal conduct, diminish personal responsibility, or lessen the harm experienced by victims and their families.
Welcome to the debate. Imagine standing in a crowded park in broad daylight, wearing a fake cast, looking a stranger directly in the eye, and, lying to lure them to your car.
It's terrifying to even think about.
Right? For a normal person, your heart would be pounding out of your chest. Your hands would shake with the adrenaline of what you're about to do. But Ted Bundy felt absolutely nothing. So today we're asking how forensic psychology actually categorizes and, understands this kind of chilling predatory behavior.
Yeah, and it's one of the most complex questions in forensic science. I mean, we're looking at an individual characterized by deception, superficial charm, and extreme predatory aggression. And we're trying to figure out the most scientifically rigorous way to evaluate that pathology.
Exactly. So the central issue we're tackling today is this. When evaluating complex, severe criminal behavior, which framework provides a more accurate understanding? Are we better served by the observable behavior-based psychiatric diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder or by the internal personality-driven forensic construct of psychopathy?
Right. And this whole discourse emerges directly from looking at how forensic professionals apply different frameworks to cases like Bundy's. Specifically, we're contrasting the methodologies of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, against the Hare Psychopathy Checklist Revised, or the PCLR.
Right. And I argue that the DSM's psychiatric diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder, or ASPD, provides the most objective, reliable framework because it's grounded in a documented, lifelong pattern of observable behaviors.
And my position is that the forensic construct of psychopathy is superior because behavioral checklists are insufficient without measuring the profound internal emotional and interpersonal deficits, like grandiosity and a lack of empathy, that drive true predators.
Let's actually break down what antisocial personality disorder really is, because it gets thrown around in pop culture a lot.
Oh, constantly. Yeah.
Right. But in the clinical world, this is a formally recognized, empirically grounded psychiatric diagnosis in the DSM. What makes ASPD scientifically rigorous is that it strictly relies on objective behavioral criteria.
Well, observable criteria.
Exactly. We aren't guessing how someone feels. We're looking at a pervasive disregard for the rights of others. We're tracking repeated unlawful behavior, deceitfulness, impulsivity, extreme aggression.
Reckless disregard for safety.
Yes, and persistent irresponsibility. But here is the crucial part, and this is really the core of why ASPD is so robust. A clinician cannot properly diagnose you with ASPD based solely on your adult crimes.
Right. You're talking about the age 15 cutoff.
Precisely. There must be documented evidence of conduct disorder symptoms prior to age 15. And why does the DSM require that? Because adult criminality can be driven by, a million different environmental factors.
Sure. Poverty, addiction.
Extreme stress, a catastrophic life event. All of these can lead an adult to break the law. But if an evaluator can document that you were torturing animals, destroying property, and breaking into homes at age 12, it shows a profound developmental wiring issue. It isn't just a reaction to a bad adult hand. You can't fake a juvenile arrest record. This makes ASPD a rigorously documented historical pattern rather than, a subjective guess about a person's personality.
I see what you're saying, but plus,
The behavior cannot be exclusively explained by other conditions like schizophrenia or a bipolar manic episode. We are looking at hard, verifiable evidence of choices over a lifetime.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Relying solely on behavioral outputs entirely misses the underlying pathology.
How so?
Well, psychopathy isn't a DSM psychiatric diagnosis. You're right about that. But it is a specialized forensic and research construct that is absolutely essential for accurate risk assessment. Think about it this way. ASPD measures the exhaust. Psychopathy measures the engine.
Okay, I like the analogy, but
ASPD casts an incredibly wide net. An individual might have an extensive criminal record, they might get into bar fights, they demonstrate repeated impulsivity, and boom, they meet the criteria for ASPD.
right.
But that same individual might entirely lack the chilling interpersonal detachment that characterizes a true predator. They might feel deep remorse after the fact,
But the ASPD criteria do account for a lack of remorse.
only as a behavioral checklist item, not as a profound structural deficit. Psychopathy evaluates the internal traits that actually drive the worst offenders: superficial charm, shallow emotional responses, grandiosity, pathological lying,
Yeah, but
without understanding the internal affective framework, meaning the emotional operating system of the person, like their profound absence of empathy or their lack of physiological stress when deceiving someone. You're just tallying up crimes without understanding the psychology driving them.
that's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. How do we objectively measure an internal trait like limited empathy compared to a rigorously documented arrest record before the age of 15?
Well, the PCLR,
Before we can even talk about how these tools apply to a serial offender, we have to look at the scientific validity of the tools themselves. Most people with ASPD do not become serial killers, but the diagnostic criteria give us a medically standardized baseline.
a baseline of exhaust, yeah.
But evaluating a behavioral history of school suspensions is empirical. It happened or it didn't. Evaluating shallow affect or superficial charm is inherently subjective. You're asking a clinician to sit in a room and decide, is this person charming or are they just polite? That feels like a very dangerous foundation for forensic science.
But you're framing the PCLR as if it's an online personality test or some BuzzFeed quiz where an evaluator just sits in a room and makes a subjective guess about someone's emotional warmth.
It relies heavily on interviews, doesn't it?
That is a fundamental misunderstanding of how the construct is applied in the field. The PCLR is a highly structured, professional clinical instrument. It requires rigorous, face-to-face interviews, yes, but it equally requires what we call collateral information.
Which means looking at their records.
Right, but deep, comprehensive records. An evaluator doesn't just take the subject's word for it. They're digging through old juvenile hall reports, interviewing childhood teachers, reading prison write-ups, analyzing relational history.
Okay, so they are looking at behavior.
We are looking for independently verified data that demonstrates a lifelong pattern of emotional manipulation. It's true that someone can have profound psychopathic traits without an extensive record of criminal convictions. And honestly, that's exactly the dangerous reality that ASPD entirely misses.
You think people are just slipping through the cracks?
Absolutely. An individual with high psychopathic traits might be operating in society, ruining lives through pathological lying and financial manipulation, but because they avoided getting arrested for stealing a car before age 15, ASPD fails to capture them. The objective arrest record you prize so highly is often just a measure of who was sloppy enough to get caught.
Getting caught or having a documented history of severe conduct violations still provides a tangible, standardized metric. Look, when you point out that the PCLR uses collateral information, I agree that brings in a necessary layer of objectivity.
Thank you.
But the instrument is still fundamentally attempting to quantify the unquantifiable. Traits like grandiosity or manipulativeness are fluid. They change based on who the person is talking to.
Not over a lifespan, they don't.
But a behavior such as engaging in extreme physical aggression or persistent irresponsibility is a concrete event. ASPD requires that concrete history. The diagnostic criteria demand evidence of a failure to conform to social norms.
Right.
And that creates a clinical firewall against diagnosing someone based on how polished their self-presentation happens to be during an interview.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered that evaluating someone's repeated unlawful behavior without understanding the internal engine driving that behavior leaves forensic psychology effectively blind?
Blind? I wouldn't say blind.
Let's talk about instrumental versus reactive violence. ASPD tells us that an individual has a history of breaking rules and getting aggressive. But it does not distinguish between an impulsive, hot-headed individual who acts out of immediate environmental frustration, like getting into a fight at a bar because someone insulted them,
Okay.
and a cold, calculating individual who plans their offenses for weeks with meticulous emotional detachment. That is instrumental violence. It's hunting.
I see the distinction.
The distinction between the bar fighter and the hunter lies entirely in the affective framework. That is exactly what the psychopathy construct measures and what the DSM leaves out.
You're arguing that ASPD provides a clinical firewall. But if we look at how these frameworks explain specific, complex criminal methodology, we see that firewall tested in real time. Let's use Ted Bundy's selective presentation as a testing ground here, since his case really crystallized this debate for the forensic community.
And Bundy perfectly showcases why the psychopathy construct is absolutely necessary. Look at his actual methodology. We talked about it at the top of the show, his ability to feign injury.
Right, the fake cast.
Approaching victims while wearing a sling or a fake cast, dropping his books to elicit sympathy, or impersonating authority figures, that demonstrates the unique interpersonal manipulation and grandiosity that are central to psychopathy.
Well,
These are exactly the traits early pioneers like Harvey Cleckley were analyzing. ASPD tells us that Bundy broke the law repeatedly. Psychopathy explains how he deceived his victims without the physiological stress, the sweating, the stuttering, or the guilt that would stop a normal person in their tracks.
but did he really lack all stress, or was he just practiced?
The superficial charm, the pathological lying, the absolute lack of remorse, these internal mechanisms allowed him to approach victims in broad daylight. ASPD simply cannot articulate the mechanics of that deception.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. We need to be very, very careful with the mythology surrounding his so-called charm.
Mythology?
Yes, mythology. If you watch the popular documentaries, you're probably thinking of him as this flawless, charming mastermind. But we have to look at the behavioral reality. A significant retrospective study was conducted where nearly 96% of participating highly experienced mental health clinicians assigned him an antisocial personality disorder diagnosis based on his behavior.
Okay, but
They didn't need to measure his soul. They looked at his extreme aggression, his deceitfulness, his impulsivity, and his profound disregard for human life.
what about the charm that allowed him to operate?
It wasn't some mystical internal trait. It was impression management. It was a highly practiced selective ability to appear engaging when he knew cameras were present or when it served a predatory purpose.
I think that's downplaying it.
Furthermore, strong retrospective evidence is not the same as a direct contemporary evaluation. So relying on historical anecdotes of how charming he was is scientifically precarious. The ASPD reality is that he was incredibly sloppy.
Sloppy. He evaded capture for years across multiple state lines.
He evaded capture because law enforcement databases weren't connected in the 1970s, not because he was a genius. Let's look at the reality of his competence rather than his confidence.
Okay.
The behavioral reality aligns much closer to the severe impulsivity of ASPD. He made massive, consequential mistakes. He left physical evidence behind. He got pulled over for driving erratically in residential neighborhoods.
True, but
He skipped custody only to offend again in highly chaotic, disorganized ways that led directly to his final capture. If we elevate this charming psychopath concept, we ignore the persistent irresponsibility and recklessness that actually defined his timeline.
yeah, but you can have both.
The ASPD framework keeps us grounded in what he did, which was often desperate and impulsive, rather than getting seduced by the narrative of his supposedly brilliant manipulation.
Desperation at the very end of his run does not negate the profound emotional detachment that allowed him to organize, conceal, and execute his crimes for years prior.
I'm not saying it negates it. I'm saying it contextualizes it.
Yes, the 96% study was retrospective, but it actually proves my point. ASPD is the baseline diagnosis for anyone who commits severe, repeated crimes. It's the wide net. But his behavior was highly selective.
Selective, sure.
Think about the courtroom footage showing a man actively managing his appearance, wearing a bow tie, smiling for the cameras. That perfectly illustrates the mask of sanity that Cleckley wrote about.
Again, impression management.
If you only look at his ASPD traits, you capture the aggression and the rule-breaking, but you entirely miss the profound arrogance and grandiosity that led him to act as his own attorney and continuously attempt to manipulate court proceedings.
Let's talk about that grandiosity then.
Please. Grandiosity is not an ASPD criterion. It's a core psychopathic trait. He literally believed he was smarter than the judge, the prosecution, and the investigators combined, which is what led him to sabotage his own defense.
Or maybe just narcissism.
That isn't just impulsivity. That is a fundamental malfunction in how he evaluates his own limitations and his relationship to the rest of humanity. The PCLR evaluates both the antisocial behavior, which covers the impulsivity you're talking about, and those affective traits. It captures the complete psychological functioning.
But when we transition from the individual case to the broader societal implications, we run into a serious social problem regarding how behavior is explained.
How so?
When we start relying heavily on the psychopathy construct and this language of grandiosity and affective deficits, it bleeds into how the public and the legal system perceive responsibility.
I come at it from a different way. The psychopathy construct protects society precisely because it identifies predatory individuals early through their affective deficits.
Does it, though?
It cuts through the mythological monster narrative by providing a precise, clinical understanding of emotional detachment. It allows forensic professionals to conduct highly accurate risk assessments.
Okay, in a professional setting.
Exactly. If a parole board understands that a person possesses profound interpersonal deficits and shallow affect, they understand that person's capacity for instrumental, planned violence. It provides a specialized vocabulary to assess dangerousness that goes far beyond just, oh, this guy has a lot of assault charges.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because calling someone a psychopath often acts like a mythological cloak in the public eye. It's like calling a hurricane evil instead of measuring its barometric pressure. It obscures the practical reality that this person simply made repeated, purposeful decisions to inflict devastating harm.
I don't know about that.
When the public calls a hurricane evil, it stops us from looking at the meteorology, the barometric pressure, the temperature changes that actually cause the storm. Calling an offender a psychopathic monster does the exact same thing. It mystifies them.
Only if you misuse the term.
But it happens. It stops us from analyzing the mundane, verifiable timeline of their bad choices. The label frequently romanticizes offenders as criminal geniuses and obscures the practical reality of what they did.
I don't think it romanticizes them at all to the professionals using the tools.
But the foundational rule of forensic psychology is that explanation is not exoneration. When we lean heavily into the language of internal emotional deficits, it borders on inventing a monstrous archetype that implies they couldn't help themselves because their engine was broken.
That's a stretch.
Psychological language should describe the purposeful decisions to exploit trust, without creating a label that inadvertently elevates the behavior into something supernatural.
But properly applied, the concept of psychopathy does exactly the opposite of mystifying behavior. It clarifies that the behavior was entirely voluntary.
Okay.
A diagnosis or a personality construct does not provide a complete explanation for murder. An individual with high psychopathic traits knows exactly what they are doing. They simply do not care.
Right. The lack of remorse.
There is no psychosis, no hallucination explaining the action. Identifying that profound lack of empathy doesn't exonerate them. It highlights the cold, calculated nature of their choices. If we only use ASPD, we just communicate that the person breaks rules and acts aggressively. It fails to communicate the specific, chilling nature of the emotional detachment.
Yet the very foundation of ASPD is that it requires a history of choices. The individual isn't just a rule breaker. They have demonstrated a pervasive pattern of disregarding the rights of others, extending back before adulthood.
Yes, a pattern of breaking rules.
An ASPD does address this internal landscape, but it ties it strictly to empirical evidence. The criteria explicitly include a lack of remorse indicated by being indifferent to or rationalizing having hurt or stolen from another.
Right.
ASPD already captures the remorselessness, but it demands we prove it through their actions. It measures the barometric pressure. It focuses on what we can independently verify over a lifespan rather than a clinician's evaluation of their interpersonal warmth.
Measuring a lack of remorse purely through a checklist of past physical actions is not the same as evaluating the interpersonal dimension of an offender who utilizes pathological lying and superficial charm to actively conceal their predatory nature.
It's still behavior, though.
You can have someone who rationalizes stealing a car and someone who rationalizes taking a human life while smiling at the victim's family. ASPD groups them together. That is the chilling reality that only the psychopathy construct adequately addresses.
Which brings us to a crucial point of summary. My position remains that evaluating a rigorous, documented history of unlawful behavior and developmental milestones, specifically through the ASPD framework, provides the most objective, reliable lens for analyzing persistent rule violation. It keeps forensic psychology tethered to empirical, observable facts, preventing us from diagnosing someone based on the subjective interpretation of their charm.
And I maintain that without assessing the profound internal emotional deficits and the specific mechanisms of interpersonal manipulation evaluated by the PCLR, we fail to grasp the complete psychological functioning of predatory offenders. Behavioral checklists alone are simply insufficient for understanding the engine driving instrumental violence.
We do agree, however, that these concepts overlap substantially in practice.
Oh, definitely.
Criminal conduct alone is not enough to establish either ASPD or psychopathy.
Absolutely. Rigorous assessment requires developmental history, extensive collateral records, and evidence extending far beyond a single offense. And crucially, neither label diminishes personal or legal responsibility. Both frameworks agree that these are individuals making conscious choices. Explanation is not exoneration.
Exactly. We remain in disagreement over whether behavioral checklists or internal personality traits offer the more precise diagnostic anchor. But layering the technical psychiatric diagnosis of the DSM with the forensic construct of the PCLR provides a much richer, multidimensional understanding of these high-profile cases than popular media portrayals ever allow.
The complexity is what makes the analysis necessary. The superficial, charming psychopath myth simply does not survive contact with rigorous psychological evaluation, regardless of which tool you choose to emphasize.
There's certainly more to explore in the source material regarding the developmental origins of these disorders.
Oh, for sure.
Specifically, how clinicians distinguish early conduct disorder from trauma, psychosis, or simple developmental immaturity in adolescence, which is a critical question we must ask when examining cases involving juvenile offenders like Mary Bell in the future.
The developmental trajectory is vital. We have to look at how these traits or behaviors manifest before the adult patterns permanently lock in.
We will leave the discussion there, allowing you to consider which framework provides the more analytically rigorous approach to understanding predatory behavior. When evaluating the darkest corners of human behavior, when the pathology isn't a neat, visible fracture, but rather a hidden pattern masked by impression management.
Right.
We have to ask ourselves, are we better served by measuring the shadow of their actions or by trying to map the void inside?
You've been listening to Mind, Law, and Motive, a crime, mind, and evidence podcast. Today's debate leaves us with an important conclusion. Antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy may illuminate different dimensions of severe criminal behavior, but neither diagnosis nor psychological construct provides a complete explanation for murder. Understanding behavior is not the same as excusing it. Explanation is not exoneration. In a future episode, we'll examine an equally difficult developmental question: how clinicians distinguish conduct disorder from trauma, psychosis, and developmental immaturity when evaluating juvenile offenders such as Mary Bell. Which framework did you find more persuasive? The observable behavioral evidence emphasized by ASPD, or the emotional and interpersonal traits measured by the psychopathy construct? Share your position in the comments. Subscribe to Crime, Mind, and Evidence for more evidence-based discussions where psychology, law, and criminal behavior intersect.